Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of People Also Ask and We Answer, the interview series by Clearbox AI. We all know that artificial intelligence is constantly changing and improving our lives, and we also can see its power applied to business every day. Here, AI and machine learning opportunities can really help a business to improve their processes and outcomes. And to do so, companies need to feed the AI engine they're working with their fuel, which is data. On the one hand, AI models need to be accurate, working on good quality and real-world data. On the other hand, this can come with some privacy risks. So, what we can do to prevent them? Let's discover this topic with our two guests for today. Shalini Kurapati, CEO and co-founder at Clearbox AI.
Hi, Alessandra. Nice to be here again.
And Marlon Domingus, DPO, Data Protection Officer at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Hello, Marlon. It's great to have you here today.
Hello, good to see you and good to speak to you finally.
Yeah. So, Marlon, maybe you would like to start to introduce yourself and tell us about your current projects.
I serve as a data protection officer for the Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And I specialize in GDPR and write and speak about many topics, privacy governance, data ethics, privacy by design, privacy engineering, risk management, and privacy audit. So a broad range. I have a background in philosophy, so I see myself as a philosopher in the world of privacy, which for me means from an European perspective, so the relations between the rule of law, human rights and democracy.
As you may know, this format of interviews is called People Also Ask and We Answer because it's based on the most researched questions on Google, on search engines, on a specific topic. Since today we're talking about privacy in AI, I'd like to start asking you a very generic question about this topic, which is, what are the privacy issues related to AI?
Privacy is a blessing and a fundamental right, actually, and the GDPR protects these rights. And what we see in practice is that most people find it hard to implement the principles that are defined in the GDPR, and thus the impression occurs that privacy is difficult. But in fact, I would like to oppose that idea. I think in most cases people think of privacy as data protection, as security stuff. But for privacy, you really have to do other things, and you have to have a different logic. Now, this related to AI is a very interesting question, of course, and because sometimes in AI systems, personal data are processed. Privacy is an issue and is to be considered, but I would suggest not to tick the box, but to really dive into the topic and what is exactly the nature of the processing of the personal data. And then we see it's more complex than is considered in the logic of the GDPR. And that is why we need to focus on the specifics of AI. I think we've seen good examples of AI for good, where we can see that big data does indeed help us, and AI used for recognizing patterns in the big data based upon on questions that we already ask ourselves. So that is the good side of AI. So I'm not a critic of AI, but I also think that we could look at AI for so what is the good, the bad, and the ugly? So when things go really wrong, what can we learn from this? And I wanted to give a very big example from the Netherlands, where 26,000 innocent families were wrongly accused of social benefits fraud, partially due to a discriminatory algorithm used by the Dutch tax authorities. So citizens were forced to pay back money they didn't owe, and many families were driven into financial ruin, and some were torn apart. And others were left with lasting mental health issues, and a remarkable large number of children, more than 1,000, were taken from their homes, from their families. What I think is that if we apply AI as a black box and say, okay, the computer says so, or the algorithm says so, the legal person is lost because the algorithm is more important than what the legal redress of the citizens. The courts leave the algorithms more than the individuals, and the distinction between fact and fiction was lost because the reality of the people was conflicted by what the state said that was the case. And I think in the end, privacy is about trust. Can we trust markets? Can we trust our government? How do they treat our data? And part of this is how they build algorithms and use it for decision making, and how it affects us and how data is used against us. So there's the good and the bad, and I think those both matter in relation to privacy and AI.
Since we talked in general about privacy in AI, I would like to ask you, Shalini, more in detail, how can we protect privacy while building AI projects?
Companies don't want to hear all the nuances because it's complicated, it's messy, it's you have to have a holistic view of what does it mean. So privacy means a number of rights, not just data protection. Data protection is more the one that you can operationalize. It's easier to implement, So what I would like to extend in terms of privacy risks is like whatever you can, like look into the privacy risks. The most important thing is what is the risk of re-identification. I'm going to use a lot of methods, and with my anonymization techniques, am I able to guarantee that this data set is privacy proof, or like is it good enough? Like Marlon was saying, AI is a complex process where you have an entire cycle of data. You start from acquisition, you transform it, you store it, then there is something else happening, and then it goes into the model, and then the model keeps improving. So you have like an entire cycle, and each side you need to have mechanisms where you can actually test these risks or work in an environment where you can make sure that it's safe for the data subjects of whom you're using, and safe in terms of regulation, safe in terms of even physical safety or even mental safety, for that matter. Of course, this is more the generic picture about what we need to consider. And we specifically at Clearbox, as you very well know, we do a more of a test bed approach. So where we say that if possible, let's not use real data. From my perspective, starting with synthetic data, for example, is a great way to already remove a number of risks that will come along, and then slowly try to see at what stage can you include real data, and also based on the GDPR principles, what is the purpose? Are you using it for testing and improving your systems, or are you using it to share the data? So that also depends. Another thing is also the proportionality, right? Like, so how risky is this? So if it's very high risk, probably you need to undergo a lot more mechanisms, or maybe you need to implement everything in every stage of your process. But if the risk is relatively low, you can also tailor your needs based on the level of risk. So for me, I would start already with the data minimization. Try not to use the real data. If you have the possibility of training an algorithm with synthetic, start with that.
And Shalini, maybe we can also say if there are any advantages in using which anonymization techniques, if synthetic data are in any way better or more useful than others.
I think the main question here is the principle of privacy versus utility balance, because how do we still have data that is complete, that represents the real world, and still protect privacy? And this is very hard to achieve, because with most anonymization techniques, you could also create unnecessary or unwanted effects in your AI models if you remove too much information. So, and to have a balanced effect in between privacy and utility, synthetic could be a very strong contender for this, because in terms of direct identification, it's very difficult to directly identify using synthetic. There are some other risks like inference, but that needs to be addressed, of course. But for me, the biggest advantage would be to have a high utility with low privacy risk. That would be my main point of view.
And so we talked about privacy in AI largely, and When you talk about privacy, one of the first things that comes to mind is law and regulation, of course. So among many regulation in the world, we often talk about GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulation. And so, Marlon, I would like to ask you, how does GDPR affect AI?
From a legal point of view, this is going to be very interesting. The GDPR is a sort of, I have to also mention the e-privacy regulation. Mm-hmm. They are a couple. Then the DSA and the DMA are a couple, which have a different logic again from compared to the GDPR, where there's a more basic and more simplistic allocation of responsibilities of the processing of the data. And then we have these other regulations that are also got the DGA and the DA, the Digital Governance Act and the Digital Act, which are created to promote the reuse of data, also for instance, for AI purposes. As usual, it's going to be difficult to understand the guidances, so the implementation, the practical implementation aspects of how these legislations work together, which is in specific cases where two legislations are in conflict, which one has the higher hierarchy, so which is the lex specialis. These things have to be decided. And one of the critical points I also hear in the debates about the AI Act and the DSA and the DMA is that there's a legal framework, but the technical implementation is sometimes based on certain assumptions, which in practice mean investments from organizations to be compliant to these regulations. So I'm afraid that just like with the GDPR, where these regulations were in place to do good things, the GDPR was in place to have a stronger digital single market, to have a free flow of data between the countries and the organizations within the EU, to promote public-private collaborations and to have innovation and a stronger internal market. But in what we see in practice is that people do the checkbox approach, and I think we can expect the same with the AI Act. And the AI Act is also risk based, as is the GDPR. The definitions in the GDPR also apply to the AI Act. So, for instance, what is biometric data? But there's a whole set of new data. New concepts. For instance, the data is not only personal data, but we have, like Shalini already said, we have training data, validation data, testing data, input data, and we all need to be in control. And like Shalini also said, we have to have mechanisms to be able to address these things. So the fact that also the AI Act is risk-based, and we now have a sort of classification of forbidden AI and high-risk AI and low-risk, already helps a bit in understanding the complexity and the possible impact on citizens. And a lot of the discussions will be focused on that classification and on the measures. I really applaud Clearbox AI for taking these bold steps towards working with synthetic data. I really agree with everything Shalini said. Also, the fact that you can do too much damage to the data when you pseudonymize or anonymize in a too early a stage, because the conclusions based on this poor data can be questionable, which is also for research a problem, I think, if you do not really understand what you're doing and when and why and so on. Perhaps one last thing. I think a lot of focus is on the data, but I think one of the underlying problems with regards to the application of AI systems is we have two conflicting drivers: the efficiency and the trust thing, which you cannot put in algorithms so much. It's not a mathematical formula that you can apply. This is where the human interface is important, and human oversight, and really understanding the processes. And we see great examples, positive examples of this, but as earlier, also the bad examples.
And so maybe let's try to see the privacy issues in AI more from a social point of view. In this context, I want to ask you, what is the social impact of privacy issues in AI, if we can delineate it?
Marlon started the interview with giving the very strong social impact, what could happen to entire families. So it can be disruptive both economically, also health-wise, mental health. Also in terms of identity theft, it could be things like, reputation damage. These are things that we can see and probably even measure the damage. But there are also stuff that you cannot measure, like, for example, manipulation. Like if you understand what a group of people are thinking, you can manipulate their behavior. Like we know what happens with social media and the Cambridge Analytica scandal a few years ago. It's very similar. You can apply it to many different contexts. It's also a much bigger societal impact about are we really a freedom-loving democracy as we would like to show? If we don't protect privacy, people can be manipulated and not act according to their own will. So that's a bit on the higher level, I think.
And do you have any read or podcast or whatever you like to suggest to our viewers about this topic?
For me, the Hannah Arendt book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And some time ago, I read The Weapons of Mass Destruction by Cathy O'Neill. That is a very good book. And for me, the CIPL, the Center of Information Policy Leadership, the organization of which I also am a member, they created some time ago the so-called accountability wheel. So trust and accountability in both in the GDPR and in the AI Act can be implemented, I think, can be seen based on this framework. So I would suggest if you look up the CIPL accountability wheel, you see this framework, and that's for me one of my guidelines actually.
Do recognize some of the recommendations of Marlon. So I will go for a more also like the practical implementation of what we've talked about. So I think most recently I read a recent book. It's called Practical Synthetic Data Generation. And I found it very interesting. Also, it's a very practical approach about discussing all these philosophical concepts in a more applied manner. And the other, it's not a book necessarily, but if you want to like have updates about especially privacy and how professionals view privacy, I'm a part of this International Association of Privacy Professionals. They have a lot of blogs. So if you want to know about privacy in AI, there's a lot of opinion pieces from different professionals around the world about how they view it. So I would recommend also checking out their blogs.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for this excellent overview we gave about the relationship between privacy and AI. And I think it's really crucial to understand these points, at least for companies and people that are trying to approach intelligent systems in this way. And I think the road is still long, but I also think that we delineated some starting points to deal with these issues and with this topic better and in a more efficient way. So thank you very much both for being here today. Thank you, Marlon, for your time. For our viewers, don't forget to follow us on our social media to always stay updated with the new episodes of People Also Ask and We Answer. So I hope to see you soon to the next episode. Bye-bye.